Good day, everyone. The call has started. My name is Sephutile Mhlongo, and I am Manager of Financial Regulation and Supervision with Digital Frontiers. Welcome to the Pathway to 17 Summit. Today I'm joined by Dr. Sam, who will take us through climate adaptation policy and financial regulation. Welcome, Dr. Sam, and I'll hand over to you to take us through, to introduce yourself, as well as take us through your presentation.
Thank you so much, Sophie. My name is Sam Ogallah. I'm the Commonwealth National Climate Finance Advisor to the government of Eswatini, based here in Eswatini as a country, the Kingdom of Eswatini. And I've been working, supporting the country, seconded to the country for over a year now in their climate change programs and activities around the country. It's been a pleasure to be part of this pathway to 17th Pathway Summit and this year, and also to share the experiences of what we are doing in relation to the climate adaptation policies, and not even only adaptation policies, but also mitigation, but I'll be focusing on the adaptation policies and financial regulations, what it entails, the journey so far in the country. Thank you so much for having me. So I will go straight into the presentation for today. Like I mentioned, I'll be sharing the experiences of the Kingdom of Eswatini, especially the adaptation policies as it contains in our nationally determined contribution, the NDC, and also the National Adaptation Plan that we're currently working on as a country. For now, the overarching climate policy, intervention that we have document is the nationally determined contribution, which is the background pillar to the Paris Climate Agreement. And so every country that is signatory to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the convention itself are mandated to have what we call the nationally determined contribution, which is also a policy document, an NDC. And the policy document, the NDC, contains both the mitigation, adaptation, and cross-cutting sectors. So for us in Eswatini, we've developed various climate change policies. We have the National Climate Change Policy, we have the National Climate Change Strategies, and various instruments and frameworks that the country has brought to bear over the years in an attempt to address the impact of climate change and also meeting the domestic and international obligations under the convention. So on these particular policies, I want to look into what we have done as a country in Eswatini, focusing on adaptation and mitigation in our nationally determined contribution. And then I will zero in on the adaptation component, which is what the discussion today is all about. And then we'll look again at some of the financial regulations as the case might be. Before 2015, when we first submitted our nationally determined contribution, which we call the first NDCs, we focused on two major pillars, which is adaptation and mitigation. The first NDC adaptation focus was on agriculture, biodiversity and ecosystem, services, health and water. And our mitigation component was on transportation, energies, substitute for ozone layer depletion substances. Again, in our enhanced ambition that was submitted in October 2021, ahead of the COP26 in Glasgow, we've been able to revise some of the things we've submitted in the first NDC and now to be more elaborate and inclusive. And so we expanded the scope of the adaptation in our NDC to include agriculture, again, biodiversity and ecosystem services, health, water sector, wash infrastructure, disaster risk reduction, and the cross-cutting of gender and youth. So the mitigation component also talks about the energy sector, the transport, the waste, industrial processes and products, and use, what we call the IPPU, and also agriculture and forestry, the AFOLU. Now, we have set for ourselves that we're going to cut our emission as a country by 14% by 2030, depending on getting international support. Unconditionally, we are going to reduce our emission by 4%, and conditionally, if we receive international support, we will go further to cut our emission by 14%. So all bringing to 19% emission reduction by 2030 in our adaptation and mitigation cross-cutting sector in our nationally determined contribution. Now, let's look at the adaptation measures, since that is what we'll be looking at this afternoon. I told us that adaptation measures in the nationally determined contribution focuses on agriculture. And this is a given because we know that majority of our people are dependent on climate-sensitive variables like rainfall, temperature, sunlight, and the rest. And this is agriculture, and majority of the smallholder farmers are dependent on this for livelihood and for their means of survival. Now, the adaptation measure also focus on infrastructure, how our infrastructure needs to adapt to the changing climate. The health sector is also a priority for us in our adaptation. The water sector is also a priority in our adaptation sector in the nationally determined contribution. And then we also prioritize the ecosystem and biodiversity. Now, in the agriculture sector, what do we intend to do with this guiding policy that we have? We intend to increase the contributions of agriculture to economic development to support both food security and income generation for all the Emaswatis. And secondly, we're focusing on reducing poverty, improving food and nutrition security through sustainable use of natural resources, improve access to market, and improve disaster risk management system in our agriculture sector. Again, under these two pillars in the agriculture sector, we have itemized various measures that we're going to take, interventions that will lead us to achieving these two big goals that we have set to achieve in the agriculture sector. In the increasing contribution to the agriculture sector to the economy, we're looking at flood control, irrigation, and efficient water usage. Also, we're looking at utilizations of invasive alien species. We're also diversifying from heavy water consuming enterprises to drought tolerant and also commercially viable crops, trees, and livestock for the country. Now, in restoring, reducing poverty and improving the food and nutritional security, we are going to be dealing with issues of production of various diversified means of food production, biofortifications and fortification to meet the nutritional needs. We're also looking at improving alternative nutrition security within the special focus of all the vulnerable groups. Key to that particular intervention is the adoption of climate smart agriculture. This has various pillars in the climate smart agriculture where we tend to build resilience, increase productivity sustainably, reduce emission, and also improve the economic livelihood of the people and contribute to economic growth. Now, the water component in our nationally determined contribution also focused on 11 interventions. We're looking at improving the water governance and compliance to the water resources. Another intervention we're going to be doing under the water sector in our adaptation focus is to secure climate-proof water to increase community resilience and boost adaptive capacity. Now, we also strengthen the control and monitoring of water availability and use. The fourth intervention in that area is to assess sustainable water supply option beyond 2030, which is the target for our NDC. We will also strengthen the capacity of early warning system to reduce disaster risk. The sixth is that we're going to create enabling environment for the governance of water, sanitation, and hygiene infrastructures. We also develop and implement catchment adaptation plans and strategies in the two Kundlias and in the various regions. We're going to design and construct water storage infrastructures, including water harvesting facilities, deploying to various communities across the country. Another intervention, which is the ninth, is the control of invasive alien species and pollution control in the catchment areas. We're going to be developing water pricing structures and encourage efficient water use. Again, for those who are familiar with Eswatini as a country, our agriculture sector, majorly, the major agricultural practice is the sugarcane. And we know sugarcane is water intensive. And because of that, we're going to be developing efficient use of water. We're going to be introducing solar drip irrigation system to our farmers across the countries and the various practitioners in the sector. And then finally, in that sector, the water sector, we're going to enhance a wash sector contribution to sustainable, healthy livelihood. On the health sector, in our nationally determined contribution under the adaptation pillar, we have 4 major interventions we're going to be doing to address the gaps and also meeting our commitment through the NDC to the Paris Climate Agreement. The first is to enhance the legal and policy with institutional framework for the health sector. The second is to enhance adaptive capacity in the health sector, financing the health sector actors to address inequalities related to climate vulnerabilities. We'll be promoting capacities building through research and development of education and awareness and training. We'll also be building the third intervention in our health sector will be to build the capacity of the health sector itself, like strengthening the healthcare workers on the adverse impact of climate change, make sure that we climate-proof our health sector. We're also leveraging on technologies to help our health sector to adapt to the impact of climate change. Under this particular intervention, we are going to be enhancing and establishing a multi-hazard early warning system to trigger prompt public health interventions when certain variables exceed the defined threshold. So these are 4 major pillars under the health sector in our adaptation pillar component of our NDC. Then the ecosystem and biodiversity sector is another pillar interventions on the NDC. We have also aligned various measures in the ecosystem and the biodiversity sector to address the climate interventions that we promise to deliver between now and 2030 under our NDC. Some of the interventions in the ecosystem and biodiversity include setting up of actions and interventions in ecological infrastructure. We're also going to strengthen regenerative landscape management system. We're going to also improve on the conservation of genetic resources, building on indigenous trees and the land traces. We're going to be working on the restoring and protecting our wetlands across the country, reducing pressure, driving biodiversity loss, such as deforestation, human settlements, and the likes. We're going to be establishing long-term biodiversity, conservation, and restoration. We're going to be conducting research, innovations, knowledge, and sharing income-generating activities that will help to improve the restoration of the ecosystem and biodiversity in the country. Then we look at the infrastructure sector, because we also know the vulnerability of the infrastructure sector to the impact of climate change and how the infrastructure sector needs to adapt to the changing climate as a country. Having conducted our vulnerability risk assessment in the country, we came to realize how vulnerable our infrastructure sector is to the impact of climate change and the need for adaptation options and interventions in that sector. So in the infrastructure sector, again, we have outlined various measures that will help us to address the impact of climate change and also better adapt our infrastructure to the impact. Some of the interventions include climate-proofing our existing infrastructure, particularly the critical infrastructures. We're going to be building the capacity also of the institutions at various levels, even up to the community level, to mainstream climate change into infrastructure designs. We will develop nature-based solutions for urban infrastructure and for adaptation benefits towards reducing the disaster risk management and effort. We're going to be implementing integrated waste management for resilient ecosystem. And this will help us to reduce pollution that is associated with the infrastructure sector and building a healthier community. We're going also to build the capacity and implement climate smart planning for urban resilience and enhancing the adaptive capacity of urban dwellers. And ultimately, we're going to be improving evidence base of climate change impact on the infrastructure to support our decision-making as a country. So these are just few of the interventions we have outlined as a measure under the infrastructure in our adaptation component in the nationally determined contribution to the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, the sector that is cross-cutting among these sectors that I've mentioned in the agriculture, in the adaptation pillar, include gender. All our intervention, the adaptation intervention that I've mentioned in the various sectors, agriculture, water, ecosystem and biodiversity, health, and infrastructure, are going to be gender sensitive. So gender issues is going to be cross-cutting across all the adaptation options that we have put forward to deliver as a country. The issue also with youth is also very paramount in the delivery of our adaptation interventions for the country. Again, we know that the youth constitute the majority of the population in Eswatini. So because of that, the youths are also part of the group that are most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. When you talk about the women group, the next group, the youth and the elderly and the physically challenged. So these are part of the interventions that we're going to do. And for the aspect of gender, youth, this we are mainstreaming and integrating them into our adaptation options, all the adaptation interventions that we have under our NDC and our contribution to the Paris Climate Agreement. Another cross-cutting sector that runs through all the adaptation options that we, interventions that we're going to be doing under our NDC is the disaster risk reduction. Again, if this is not done well, if it is not mainstream, it is not prioritized, and is also not factored in, it will erode all the effort in the various sectors that we're going to be providing intervention for in our adaptation sector. And so the cross-cutting sectors of gender, youth, disaster risk reductions are paramount to the delivery of our adaptation pillar in our nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement. Again, what does this entail? What is the overview of the capacity and the cost of implementation of our NDCs? During the development of our NDCs, of which we have the adaptation component, which I'm speaking to this day, and also the mitigation and the cross-cutting, we've taken also the capacity assessment. We've undertaken vulnerability assessment. We've also taken some measures to cost. What will each of these interventions cost us? What are the gaps that we need to fill? And how can we roll out the implementation of our nationally determined contribution and the adaptation component together with the mitigation component to be able to reduce our emission unconditionally by 4% and conditionally by 14%, giving us a total of 19% by 2030 if we assess external support. Some of the capacity needs are the technical capacity we will find out that is required, technical knowledge and skills. We discovered that there are shortage of technical staffs, especially at the national level, to deal with the issues of climate change. The issues of climate change are becoming like a new thing to different ministries, departments, and agencies. And so building their capacity to be able to, run with these interventions, factor and mainstream, and also begin to integrate adaptation options into policies, programs, and actions is paramount. Also, the second overview of the capacity needs is the Eswatini investment need for mitigation and adaptation. The amount of climate finance received when we did our climate public expenditure and institutional review, which the Commonwealth Secretariat supported the country to undertake between 2015 to 2019, we discovered that a lot of climate finance needs to be mobilized in addition to what the domestic resource mobilization for the country. So there is a huge need to mobilize financial resources to be able to, for us to address the impact of climate change. In line with this also, the Commonwealth Secretariat has supported the government of Eswatini to develop its climate, what we call the private sector engagement strategy in NDC actions. This is for us to fill in this gap. We discovered that the role of the private sector in delivering both the mitigation and adaptation component of our intervention is crucial. And so, with the support from the Commonwealth Secretariat, the Kingdom of Eswatini currently have the private sector engagement strategy. And we are bringing all the private sector, both domestic and international, on board in order to help in the mobilization, also in the implementation of climate change activities in the country. Because we also discovered that around 210 trillion US dollars are seated with the private sector. And so if we need this money to implement, and the role of private sector is key to the delivery of our adaptation options and mitigation options in our NDC, we cannot leave them behind. Then we have to tap into what it exists in the private sector. Now, the issue of institutional capacity, we need to build also upon the limited capacities that are there to implement our NDCs. We also discovered the technology transfer and diffusion, that the high capital costs as a barrier to take up new technology for adaptation and mitigation. There is also a need for effective monitoring, reporting, and verification system that we need to set in place. We also discovered that we need a data management and management information system to enable us track and also implement and report back on our adaptation and mitigation options. On the overall, it's going to cost us as a Kingdom of Eswatini between $915 US to 1.5 billion US dollars for us to implement our NDC between now and 2030. And now when you talk about the issue of the regulations, financial regulations, national adaptation plans, currently we are working to develop the national adaptation plan, which is NAP. And we're also working as a country on climate change bill, which eventually will become an act. The climate change bill will provide financial regulations and the framework for financial monitoring, reporting, and verification for various actors, both the state and the non-state actors across the country, and will help us to deliver, becomes on our NDCs, and it becomes a legal framework upon which every financial regulations, climate change activities, and interventions in the countries is going to be measured upon. Thank you, and let me stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Sam. That was a comprehensive review of the country's national adaptation journey. What I found most insightful was that we've been hearing a lot in the climate stream from a more capital markets perspective, and now we get the policy perspective as to how does this, what's the fiscal policy framework, what does it look like in practice at community level, or what is the government's plan for communities? We are a bit pressed for time, but I will just ask this question that I have, which is, in light of all of this, right? Why should climate adaptation policy be made a priority? Because you mentioned that it's going to cost $950 million US dollars to over $1 billion, between $950 million US dollars to over $1 billion. So why should we make climate adaptation policy, which is so costly, a priority, as opposed to using the resources for more pressing national concerns, such as addressing poverty, the unemployment rates, which are extremely high in the country? And you have 2 minutes to respond to this.
Thank you so much. Like we know that climate change is a risk and threat multiplier. So the earlier we prioritize climate change, the better. Because if we don't prioritize climate change, which is a risk and a threat multiplier, every other effort towards poverty eradication, towards creating jobs, towards better health, towards better economy can be eroded within a second. One impact of climate change can turn the tides back and the time backward 10 times. So prioritizing climate change is key because it has a direct consequences on other priorities of the government. If we don't do this, it can erode every other effort made to reduce poverty, to create jobs, to build infrastructure. Imagine if there is a flood and there is a climate-induced disaster, the whole of this effort will go down the drain. So prioritizing climate change, which is a threat multiplier, as well as a risk multiplier, should be key and should not be seen as a competitor to other completing demands by the government or any other country. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 4 minutes left. So I'd just like to bring back something that 3 minutes rather, that you mentioned, which was around, which I found very, a new perspective to the discussions that we've been having, which was you brought in the health, building resilience and climate resilience in the health sector. And I don't think that's something that we have come across so far. So thank you for bringing that out. And it would definitely I will be exploring it further as to what does that look like in practice, and following obviously how the government proceeds with this as a Swazi myself. With just 1 minute, may you please provide your concluding remarks, as unfortunately we don't have, we could talk for hours, but because we're pressed for time, please share your concluding remarks. And yeah.
Thank you so much. I think my message is simple, that climate change is here with us. It's not rhetoric, it's not science, completely science. It's something we're living with, we're seeing the impact daily. So the time to act is now. Tomorrow might be too late. In fact, the better time to act was yesterday. So we have every opportunity at any stage we find ourselves, wherever we find ourselves, there is opportunity to do something about the planet. Save our planet, act on climate now, not tomorrow. Tomorrow might be too late. And the cost of addressing climate change tomorrow might triple if we fail to do something today to adapt to the impact of climate change. The reality is here. Let's join hands together and act on climate, and act now and even fast. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sam, and thank you to everyone who has joined us. We have come to the end of this session. We hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have enjoyed facilitating the session. We do hope we still have, we're just about to wrap up day 2, but we do have day 3 of the summit tomorrow. And we hope you'll continue to join us for our sessions, which will also be as exciting and as engaging. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.